Over the past year, 4 major Power 5 schools have announced they're going to be switching conferences in the near future. Oklahoma and Texas have announced they're headed to the SEC, and most recently, USC and UCLA have announced that they're headed to the Big Ten. Both situations are surprising in their own ways, but today I'll be giving you guys my thoughts on the situation and what could be. This could be the start of another major conference realignment. This is probably just the beginning of what's going to be a major shift to the conferences in all of college sports, and so it's a pretty big deal moving forward. And so today I'll be giving you guys a scenario as to a Power 4 conference realignment, kind of a mock conference realignment, what could happen to the schools and the conferences as we head into the near future. So that said, this situation here today is going to be in the scenario that the SEC and the Big Ten both expand to 20 teams each, which there is still a looming possibility that the SEC and the Big Ten expand to greater than 20 teams. Potentially we see just 2 major conferences with the SEC and the Big Ten taking up much of the nation. But in this situation, we're just going to go with the SEC and the Big Ten expanding to 20 teams. The ACC will lose 4 teams, but they're able to add 4 from the group of 5 conferences. The Big 12 thrives off of the Pac 12's fallout and grows to 18 teams. So basically a Big 12 Pac 12 merger, with most of the teams going to the Big 12 except for 2. The Pac 12 remains a conference, keeping only 2 current teams and adding 12 at the same time. The SEC and the Big 12 will be considered the 2 primary conferences, the 2 best conferences in most sports, and the ACC and the Big 12 will be considered the 2 secondary conferences. So if you're looking at college football, for example, this will fit perfectly. The SEC and the Big 10 are your 2 best conferences by far. The ACC and the Big 12 are also power conferences, but they'll be considered as slightly behind the SEC and the Big 10. The Big 10 will be rebranded to Big with a 1 in the middle, kind of like their logo. And the Big 12 potentially gets a new name. I feel like it's about time for the Big 10 and the Big 12 to do a little rebrand, because from what we're seeing right now, it seems as if the Big 10 is not going to have only 10 teams anytime soon. There's a chance that the Big 10 grows to 20 or more. So the Big 10, I feel like, is going to get rebranded, and I could definitely see them just being Big with a 1 in the middle, and that has been rumored as well. The Big 12, I don't know what they'd rebrand their name to be, but the Big 12 I feel like is certainly in time for a different name. The ACC and the SEC, though, completely going to stay the same, I'm sure. The Pac 12 is going to fall out of power conference conversation, but the Pac 12 will survive, I do think. I feel like the Pac 12, if there's a conference that's in trouble right now, honestly, the Pac 12 is in some trouble, but the Mountain West Conference, I think in particular, is really the conference that needs to be worried right now. I think the Mountain West is especially in trouble here. I think the Pac 12, they're losing as many teams as they are in this conference realignment to different conferences. They're not going to be picking teams off the Big 10 or the Big 12 at this point. I think the Big 12 is in a great position to take teams from the Pac 12. And in the end, I think the Mountain West is in a lot of trouble here, because the Pac 12, they're going to be looking for anybody at this point. And their only option really is the Mountain West, and that's their best option. And so I think the Mountain West Conference completely dies as a result of this conference realignment. Pac-12 is going to survive, but at the same time, the Pac-12 is not going to be considered in the conversation to be a power conference anymore. They'll be now considered to be in the group of 5, which, considering the Mountain West Conference does die in this scenario, the group of 5 will still be a group of 5 conferences. American Athletic and the Sun Belt both lose teams as a result, but they're going to take teams from the Conference USA or MAC. You could definitely say the AAC or the Sun Belt are superior to the Conference USA or MAC, especially the Conference USA, so they shouldn't have a problem there. And the American Athletic Conference, the Sun Belt, and the MAC survive, but the Conference USA, I've got them surviving in this realignment, but I do have them potentially in trouble. Potentially they could be the next conference on the chopping block. Things are changing, and certainly this is likely going to be the biggest conference realignment yet. It's pretty insane what's happening here with TV contracts, and Fox, I think, is a big. Fox Network is a huge influence on the Big Ten, going for UCLA and USC. It's so random. The Big Ten being in the region that they are, getting teams from California. It's so it's really out of nowhere. And if you look at the map of the Big Ten Conference now, it used to be like, I think, Indiana or Chicago, kind of that area is the center of the conference, or more like, Indiana, I think. Now it's Nebraska. So Nebraska used to be the school on the westernmost side of the conference for sure, and suddenly with USC and UCLA coming in, Nebraska is literally in the geographical center of the conference, which is definitely an interesting fact there. But that's it. Let's look at your conferences now. So we got the SEC here, and I do have most of these conferences, or I think 3 of these conferences, splitting up into 4 pods, meaning the teams in each of the pods will play those, especially in college football, they'll play those teams on a regular basis. So in the SEC, we got the Central pod being Georgia, Alabama, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and Auburn. That is certainly a very strong pod if you're looking at college football. I'll be using college football for a reference for most of these, just because that's what this channel is about. So you'd have Georgia and Alabama both in there, which would be very, those are your 2 best teams of the conference there. So potentially they tried to get Georgia or Alabama into a different, especially maybe Georgia, they try to put them in a different pod and substitute them for someone else. We'll see what happens potentially, but that's what I got for the Central pod. Then in the Southeast, you got Florida State. You got 3 additions here from the ACC in the Southeast pod. You got Florida State, Clemson, and Miami coming in. Clemson, keep an eye on them. I think the SEC now with the Big Ten going after these Pac-12 teams, the SEC potentially is going to try to take a couple ACC teams here. So I've got them taking North Carolina, which North Carolina is in the North pod here. But we got Florida State, Clemson, and Miami in the Southeast pod. I do think Clemson, they're going to go hard after them. That would be an insane addition there to bring in Clemson. That'd be a huge flex for the SEC. And Florida State, of course, they've got tremendous potential. Can't sleep on them. As a football program and as a athletic program, they're usually very relevant. And Miami, the Hurricanes as well, don't sleep on them. West Division, you got your 2 newcomers from the Big 12. You got Texas and Oklahoma, as well as LSU, Texas A&M, and Arkansas. Then the North pod, you got Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Vanderbilt, and then North Carolina from the ACC. So 20 teams for the SEC. This is how I see it shaking out. But the 4 ACC teams coming in could vary as well, potentially. I just feel like, though, it would make total sense for them to get Clemson and get into Miami with the Hurricanes and get into North Carolina with the Tar Heels. But we'll see what happens there. Moving on to the Big Ten, the big in this situation, the Central pod has got Purdue, Indiana, Northwestern, Michigan State, and the Big Ten lands Notre Dame. So Notre Dame is going to be in my Big Ten here, in the Central pod in particular. I think Notre Dame is, they're kind of on the fence right now. And let me just say, if that goes through and turns out, right now this is being recorded in early to mid-July of 2022. So, certainly things could very much happen and very quickly over the next few weeks. I think they're waiting on the Big Ten is waiting on a decision from Notre Dame to join the conference. So Notre Dame accepts. You got the Fighting Irish in there. Potentially the Big goes after a few more Pac-12 teams as well. But looking at the East pod here, we got Michigan and Ohio State. Got to have them in the same pod. And then Penn State, Maryland, and Rutgers also in there. The West pod, the West division, has got UCLA, Oregon, USC, Washington, and Stanford. 5 current Pac-12 teams in that West pod, which would make total sense. You got them in the Big Ten, you got them in the conference, but they are in the same pod there. So Stanford, potentially Stanford or Colorado. I think Washington and Oregon are both pretty clear targets for the Big Ten, but it's either going to be Stanford or Colorado. Just depends on the market that the Big Ten wants to go after. Stanford, you get kind of into that San Francisco area, and if you went for Colorado, you kind of get into the Denver area. So really, both situations could very well work out, but I think Stanford in the end. They've been in rumors a little bit more, so I'm just going to put Stanford as the addition to this situation. But Colorado definitely, it would make total sense for Colorado to be in the Big Ten, which honestly at this point we should be prepared for really anything to happen. I think USC and UCLA was such a big surprise, seeing them all of a sudden literally in one day get into the Big Ten like that. Nothing should surprise us at this point. So, Colorado going to the Big Ten makes total sense considering UCLA and USC are now both accepted into the Big Ten. So the West Division, UCLA, USC, Washington, Stanford, and Oregon. And the Midwest, we got Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Northwestern. But you could kind of swap Illinois, Northwestern about the Central and Midwest pods. Moving on to your ACC now. So the ACC has announced they're going to be going, or just getting rid of divisions, but I'm just going to put divisions in here just in case if that changes. So your North Division is going to have Virginia Tech, Louisville, Virginia, Pitt, Duke, Syracuse, and Boston College. And your South Division is going to be adding, the ACC is going to be adding a few teams here. I've got them adding Memphis, Coastal Carolina, Louisiana, or UAB. I definitely think Coastal Carolina is a very valid option, but they could also go for East Carolina. That wouldn't surprise me either. And you also got Georgia Tech, Wake Forest, and NC State in there. Potentially the Big Ten also goes after an ACC team. There have been rumors too. The Big Ten potentially going after a team like Virginia, or even Pitt, or even trying to get into SEC country, into the Southeast even further with Georgia Tech, all those moves at this point wouldn't surprise me. Especially Georgia Tech. Keep an eye on them. Big Ten might try to go after them, but in this scenario, I'm not going to have that happening. But the ACC in the end acquires Louisiana, Memphis, Coastal Carolina, and UAB, but at the same time, they lose a couple of their major powers off to the SEC. Moving on to the Big 12, we got 18 teams in this conference. The Big 12, it looked like a year ago, was going to be the conference to go under, but turns out I think the Big 12 is doing just fine. Now with UCLA and USC, that puts the Pac 12 on the chopping block now. And the Big 12 honestly suddenly looks just fine, even though they're losing Oklahoma and Texas. North pod here is going to have Oklahoma State, Colorado, so the Colorado Buffaloes are back in the Big 12 in this scenario. Kansas and Kansas State. The East region, the East pod has got Iowa State, Cincinnati, UCF, and West Virginia. It's set in stone that Cincinnati, BYU, UCF, and Houston are joining here in the near future. So we know that for a fact. It's just a matter of who else is going to join. And once again, the Pac-12, I think, is going to have a lot of teams in the Big 12. I've got Colorado coming in from the Pac-12, Cal, Utah, Arizona State. I might be missing a couple there. But yeah, certainly I think the Pac-12 is going to have a lot of teams. It makes total sense for the Big 12. Cal, you get into the San Francisco area, you already got Utah. You had just a rival there for BYU and Utah. You get into Phoenix with Arizona State and Arizona, that kind of area. And of course, Colorado, can't forget about them. And we'll get into the rest of the Pac-12 in a second here. But yeah, the East, we went over that. West is going to have Cal, Utah, Arizona State, BYU, and Arizona. Then your Texas pod is going to have Baylor, TCU, Texas Tech, Houston, and UTSA. I've got UTSA going into the Big 12. That would be Texas if they stayed, but they're gone. So UTSA, I could see that happening. In general, they've been pretty good as an athletic program, pretty consistent. So UTSA, I've got them in the Texas pod there. So that's what your Big 12 looks like. There's 4 teams in the North and the East, but 5 in the West and the Texas pods. Moving on to your Pac-12, a conference that will be degraded to a group of 5 level. And the North Division, we've got a lot of, this conference is basically Oregon State and Washington State. I just don't see any of the conferences going after Oregon State or Washington State when you got Oregon or Washington, to schools in bigger markets. And Oregon State and Washington State have both had their times as good athletic programs, but in the end, I just don't see them being picked. Those are the 2 teams that I'm pretty confident won't be asked to or offered to be in a major conference. So they're going to be in the Pac-12. They're going to stay there, but you're going to be pretty much in a group of 5 conference now with the Mountain West teams filling in. You got Wyoming, Utah State, Boise State, Colorado State, and Air Force, along with Oregon State and Washington State in the North Division. And the South Division's got Nevada, Fresno State, New Mexico, San Diego State, UNLV, Hawaii, and San Jose State. So certainly it would be very interesting if this were to happen. I just don't think the Pac-12 goes under. I'd be surprised considering, they could just go after the Mountain West teams and suddenly the Mountain West is gone. So that's kind of what I've got happening here. And don't forget about the American Athletic Conference either. The AAC is going to be losing a lot of teams here in the near future. You got UCF, Houston, Cincinnati, especially heading into the Big 12. And that's just, you can't forget about the teams that I've got heading into the ACC. From the American Athletic as well. So in this scenario, the American Athletic and they're losing some teams. So we'll see how they're able to deal with it. But in the end, once again, in this situation, I do have the American Athletic, Sun Belt, and MAC conferences surviving. But the Conference USA, I do think potentially is in trouble in the case that this does happen, because I think the American Athletic, especially American Athletic and the Sun Belt, will be just fine with picking off teams from their competitors. But that said, let me know your thoughts in the comments below on this conference realignment and whether or not I should do more potential, do a Power 3 or even a Power 2. If the SEC and the Big Ten completely take over, which could happen. But appreciate you guys watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.